The American Civil War was a conflict that split the United States apart, between the Union and the Confederacy, the North against the South, and yet it was an affair that involved many more people than just native-born Americans. Indeed, around a quarter of the Union Army was made up of foreign-born men, with many more on both sides being either foreign or having one foreign parent. And in today's video, I'd like to look at Scandinavians in the American Civil War. That is, people from Sweden, Norway, and Denmark specifically. In the period from 1825 to around 1930, we know that around 3 million Scandinavians emigrated to the United States, and so far as we're aware, the most of those were Swedes, with a large number of Norwegians and a somewhat smaller number of Danes coming over. The vast majority of these people settled in the Midwest, in states like Wisconsin and Minnesota. And indeed, right from the get-go of the American Civil War in 1861, Scandinavians were involved on both sides of the conflict. The New York Scandinavian Society was immediately involved in the mustering of the 1st New York Infantry Regiment, putting together a company, Company A, the Scandinavian Company. The first lieutenant, Christian Christensen, was Danish and was in fact the president of the New York Society, while the captain, Ole Balling, the Norwegian, and the second lieutenant, Alfred Fredberg, were Norwegian and Swedish respectively, but had both fought in the 1848 Schleswig War against the Prussians, in which Denmark had been triumphant against their enemies, and so had invaluable experience in war and knew what they were doing. We know that the Swedish ladies of New York were responsible for sewing a regimental colours for the regiment, and indeed that the Danish community in New York provided the drums, so it really was a group Scandinavian effort, but it was only one company. If we read the Danish immigrant magazine from the United States, Emigrated, which talks about immigrants' affairs of various Scandinavians, we read in something written by Alexander Hvid about some of the motivations. He writes, "Countrymen Scandinavians, our adoptive fatherland is threatened by rebels who seek to overthrow the union that now for so many years has brought fortune and blessings to the country. It is every man's duty to defend the country he resides and makes a living in, and as a result we Scandinavians also have an opportunity to show the new world that we have not yet forgotten the heroism that since olden times has personified the Norsemen." Now, Alexander Hvid is interesting that while living in the United States for several years, he changed the spelling of his name to a more American or perhaps more Germanized Alexander Hvid. That's something that we also saw with several soldiers, Dutch soldiers who fought in the American Civil War. However, he had very strong opinions about other immigrant groups in the United States. For instance, when his company was to be merged with a German company, he wrote criticizing the decision to his commanding officers, saying, "I think it wrong to order my company into Hecke. Germans and Scandinavians never agree. They are national enemies." And this must have been difficult because in many of these areas, Wisconsin, Minnesota, a large proportion of the population were German. However, these Scandinavian citizen soldiers were keen to show the American population at large that they had their own identity and their own units. It therefore should come as no surprise that there were soon calls for not just a company of Scandinavians to be organised, but for a whole regiment. And indeed we read again in Emigrated a little later, "Scandinavians, let us recognise our present position, our duties and our responsibility as we should understand them. We have still far from carried the part of the war's burdens in respect to delivering personnel, as the Scandinavian population's great number here in the country oblige for us. While the adopted citizens of other nationalities such as the Germans and Irish have put whole regiments in the field, the Scandinavians of the West have not yet sent a single complete company of infantry to the Grand Army. Must the future ask, where were the Scandinavians when we saved the mother country?" Indeed, as they point out, several other battalions, companies and regiments in the Union Army had been made up entirely of the same ethnic group. We might think of the Emerald Flag Brigades, the Irish Brigades, and indeed many German brigades that were already in the field, and now the Scandinavians wanted their own one. Initially, the Union commanders hadn't been too fond of this idea because they were worried that many of these Scandinavian immigrants couldn't speak English very well or at all, and so following orders would be difficult. However, these Scandinavians argued that they could all speak a similar language together, and so if they were in one regiment, that shouldn't be too much of an issue. Given the concentration of where most Scandinavians lived in the Union, it should come as no surprise that it was in Wisconsin where this Scandinavian regiment would be formed, and it would become the 15th Wisconsin, also known as the Scandinavian Regiment. It would be formed in 1862, and several of its companies would have very Scandinavian names, drawing on important Scandinavian figures from history, such as St. Olaf's Rifles, named after Olav den Helge, one of the kings of early medieval Norway, and Odin's Rifles, named after the god. Their commander-in-chief would be Hans Christian Heg, a Norwegian who in his early years moved with his parents to the Norwegian colony in the Midwest of Muskego, and so he would lead the regiment into battle. He was particularly well suited, ideologically driven to fight for the Union, as in 1860 he had shielded Sherman Booth, a prominent abolitionist, from an angry mob. Indeed, Hans Christian Heg would lead well by all accounts, taking the regiment through the battles of 1862 and early 1863. However, in that year, he would be mortally wounded by enemy sharpshooters at the Battle of Chickamauga. His commander, General Rosecrans, would later say, "I am very sorry to hear that Heg has fallen. He was a brave officer and I intended to promote him to be general." Indeed, the whole regiment suffered terribly during this engagement, with some 63% of the regiment going down as fatalities, many more being wounded and captured. One who was captured was Ole Jonsson, who was taken as a Confederate prisoner of war, but in 1864 managed to escape from captivity, and following the Civil War he would become the mayor of Beloit in Wisconsin in 1886. Another regiment or company that could be mentioned was largely made up of Swedes, and this was part of the 57th Illinois Regiment, again in the Midwest, and was the Bishop Hill Company that seems to mostly have been ethnic Swedes, immigrants that formed this company to fight together. However, as is the case with most immigrant groups in the American Civil War, the majority of them didn't serve in recognizably ethnic units like the Scandinavian Regiment or the Scandinavian companies in the New York and the Illinois Infantry, but rather interspersed, maybe in small groups of their fellows from their original home country, but largely serving together with American-born and foreign-born other immigrants in these larger units. And so apart from identifying them by name, it's often very difficult to find these figures back throughout history when they're not in these ethnic regiments. So one important person to mention, an individual that had an impact on the course of the war but wasn't a soldier himself, was Jon Eriksson from Sweden. He's important because he was a naval engineer from Sweden who had emigrated to the United States, and upon the start of hostilities he wrote to the president himself saying, "Sir, the writer, having introduced the present system of naval propulsion and constructed the first screw ship of war, now offers to construct a vessel for the destruction of the rebel fleet at Norfolk and for scouring the southern rivers and inlets of all craft protected by rebel batteries. In making this offer, I seek no private advantage or emolument." Let's try that one again. Emolument. Emolument. An emolument. The returns arising from office or employment, usually in the form of compensation or perquisites of any kind. Attachment to the Union alone impels me to offer my services at this fearful crisis, my life if need be, in the great cause which Providence had called you to defend. Eriksson is important in the creation of the United States warship, the USS Monitor, in particular for his design of the turrets which were capable of rotating on these ironclad warships. These warships would be very important for the United States during the Civil War because it was part of their plan to constrict the South by imposing a full blockade on the Confederate States and then forcing their way up the rivers into the South with these ironclad ships. This was particularly important for the USS Monitor early on in the war because the Confederate States had managed to capture the hull of the USS Merrimack, with which they made their very own ironclad, the CSS Virginia. And these two ships, the Monitor and the Merrimac, now the Virginia, would meet at the Battle of Hampton Roads off the coast of Virginia, where they would engage in the first ironclad duel in history. Now, while this duel came to be inconclusive, without Ericsson's design improvements, it seems unlikely that without any kind of ironclads, the North would have stood a chance against the South, at least at sea. And so he's very important to note in this way. Indeed, the ironclads would play a very important part in keeping the blockade of the South up, and indeed in penetrating up those southern rivers and thus bringing the war to a faster conclusion. When Ericsson died in 1889, he had expressed a wish before his death that he would like to be buried in his home country, and so his remains were sent over the sea with a large flotilla of US warships, and he was indeed handed over and buried in Sweden. These warships also carried the Swedish flag, and you might see some colours in the Swedish flag that we no longer see on the side of IKEA, and that is indeed the case. If you're interested in this herring salad kind of flag, then why not check out my video on the old Norwegian flag, where towards the end I talk about this really weird Swedish flag too. Anyway, so those are some Scandinavians that fought for the North, but were there any who fought for the South? Well, you can probably guess that there were, otherwise I wouldn't have added this, and you would be right. Indeed, the Chalmette Regiment had a company of Scandinavians. This regiment was raised in Louisiana in 1862. New Orleans, after New York, was probably the biggest point of entry for most immigrants coming into the United States, and many Scandinavians also came here, and some were then recruited into this regiment, specifically forming the A Company of the Scandinavian Guard. This regiment, rather than being sent to the front lines, was used to maintain law and order in New Orleans, the city itself. And they would continue in Confederate service until the Union forces managed to capture the city, at which point some of those decided to exchange the grey for the blue and joined Union units that were raised here, although they're more difficult to keep track of. We know as well that there was a community of Norwegians settled in Texas. And interestingly enough, unlike many of the Texas Germans, who, as we saw in my video on Germans in the American Civil War, were very strongly ideologically linked with abolitionism, with the North, the ideals of the 1848 rebellions, and had thus refused service into the Confederate muster and even had rebelled against them. The Norwegians don't seem to have been that ideologically invested for the North. Indeed, those Norwegians who went to Texas can be found in various muster rolls from regiments at this time, and so it's no surprise that the Norwegian names are appearing there in those Confederate military records. They don't appear to have had a big problem with it. Another interesting figure to mention from Sweden is Augustus Forsberg. He was a Swedish military engineer who in 1855 emigrated to Charleston. At the start of the war, he joined up with the 51st Virginia Volunteer Infantry as a lieutenant and slowly worked his way up the ranks until by 1863 he had become their colonel. In 1864, he would be wounded at the Battle of Winchester and would be invalided out for recovery in a field hospital. Now, in 1865, he rejoined for the last few months of the war and was captured at the Battle of Waynesboro and made a prisoner of war. However, upon his release, he would go back to where he was kept in that hospital because he had fallen in love with his nurse, a certain Mary Elizabeth, who he decided to marry. Well, I hope they decided together, but in any case, they married following the Civil War and had a family together, deciding to stay in the south of the United States. So that is the story of the Scandinavians in the American Civil War. At least these are a few examples of stories of Scandinavians in the American Civil War. There are a few sources in various Scandinavian languages, such as about those Texas Norwegians, written in Norwegian, which I can link in the description below, as well as a few other sources for people interested in finding out a little bit more. There's also an article on the New York Scandinavian Society and how they were involved in raising those New York regiments at the start of the Civil War and some of their motivation for signing up and fighting. Let me know in the comments below, are you enjoying this series? I personally really enjoy researching this. I find it very interesting to see these various immigrant groups and some of the things that they have in common and others that are very different. Thinking about how the Irish are less ideologically motivated and more status driven, the Germans very ideologically motivated, and the Scandinavians are somewhere in between. They don't want to be left behind while other immigrant groups are forming brigades and fighting for the North. In any case, let me know, who else would you like to see? There are a few other possibilities that I could look into. Perhaps something on Poles in the American Civil War might be quite interesting. How about the involvement of the British or the French, for instance? There's a few interesting things to say there. Various Native American groups, or perhaps Mexico. In any case, let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.